I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, July 1st. The choice, world war or world peace, is our topic, and these words of JFK that you've just heard from his American University speech of June 10th, 1963, should ring throughout the world and throughout the United States on the occasion of this impending weekend of the 4th of July celebration that goes on in the United States, its Declaration of Independence and its creation as a nation. JFK made the observation, as you heard, that no government or social system is so evil as to cause its members to be said to be lacking in virtue. That, of course, has been the characteristic not only of the relationship, if you want to call it that the United States has attempted to foist upon the world, not on its own, but together with the Anglosphere, as we always refer to it, the City of London and Wall Street. But this was not always the way it was. In fact, as is obvious from the speech you just saw, there was once a time when the American presidency stood for something very, very different. And because it stood for something different at that time, even with the mistakes and even with the downright criminal activities that might have been being committed and perpetrated in the name of those presidencies, there was a correction that was capable of being made to those policies. There was an internal corrective inside of the United States. And people in the United States and people in the world could rely on an avenue by means of which great injustices could be addressed. That seems to no longer be the case, but indeed it actually is the case so long as men of goodwill and women of goodwill and conscience work to do that. Now, there's something that's going on in the world that we want to talk about, rather than talk about the news of last week, or rather than talk about news at all. What we want to talk about is the currents of current history, changes of concurrent history that are upon us and which are not very well known in the United States in particular, but also we'd say in the transatlantic sector as a whole. On the occasion of a conference that happened in Paris that was called by Macron, some of the leaders of the global South nations took it upon themselves to make people aware as a whole that the era of colonialism and the era of intellectual forms of colonial or imperial hegemony was over. And President Ramaphosa of South Africa in particular gave some words to the assembled. They were directed largely at President Macron of France, but this was a very large assembly of the entire world, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Various people were there from all over the world. And something was stated by him on this occasion. This was a conference that happened over June 23rd and 24th. And we're going to play you part of his remarks and then play an excerpt from a discussion that Lyndon LaRouche had this week in the course of her response to questions during her webcast.
But I think what is important to many of us is that there should be solid consensus on the reform of the financial architecture of the world. Because without that reform, the dreams and the objectives that we have to address our challenges will not be realized. And those reforms need to touch on a whole range of issues. Mr. Mo Ibrahim yesterday even spoke about something that we may think is insignificant, that the boards of directors of your multilateral institutions are not made up of independent directors. They are largely internal people or shareholders. So that in itself, for us, it's an important reform. We also need to look at the distribution of the special drawing rights. I find it a bit difficult to be told that this is set in the rules and it will forever be like that, and that it's either you get 0 or you get 34 billion. In our view, this is not a zero-sum game. It's a game where we all need to be dealt with equity in an equitable manner. And there is a need for reform in that regard as well. And the other important thing for this to happen, it will help us not to participate as unequal cousins in these institutions. It will help us to participate fully, and so that we don't have a sense that we are beggars, that we are being dealt with out of generosity. I think it's important in the new era that the world is in now, that there should be a good measure of equality among sovereign nations. You know, recently, 7 African countries decided to go and put a call for peace to Ukraine and to Russia. And we raised a number of issues. Zambia was represented, Comoros was represented, Republic of Congo was represented, Senegal was represented, Uganda, as well as South Africa. So we were all represented, and Egypt as well. So we were all at one, that even as we were going to address an issue of the war which has had a negative impact on the African continent, which is the rise in prices for food, rise in prices for fertilizers, we were clear that we are not going there as beggars. We are not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. We were going there to say, open up the Black Sea Channel so that the grains and the fertilizers should go into the world market. So we were not on a begging mission, even as we are in great need as a continent and all that. That should go to demonstrate that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals. Even in the multilateral institutions, we want to be treated as equals. And if our equity is at a low ebb, there must be ways in which that can be addressed. To us, this is very important. Our sovereignty is one of the things that we hold on dearly to. And we demonstrated that very clearly to both President Zelensky and to President Putin when it came to this issue. Even as there were suggestions that, yes, we can donate this, we can donate that, we said, we want you to release these grains and fertilizers to the world market so that the world can trade in these commodities and other issues we can handle in a different way. I wanted to make that point so that it should be understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world stage.
So at this conference, which thought what it was going to talk about was a $1 trillion per year climate change tax, basically, to be imposed on the world's nations, including the 54 nations of the continent of Africa. What instead happened was that President Ramaphosa and others made it clear that they came to talk about something a little bit different. They came to talk about a change that had happened in the world, a change that had very little to do with the war agenda that has been expressed around the Ukraine operation, but wanted to talk about the fact that the world had been changed by a new and the emergence of a new economic and development architecture. Now, Helga Sepp LaRouche had some comments to make about this new characteristic, if you will, that's occurred in the world.
You know, after so many decades of colonial suppression and coups and manipulations and wars which were based on lies, you know, the Iraq war, everybody knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Madeleine Albright saying 500,000 children of Iraq following the sanctions, that was worth it. I mean, if you think about what has happened in the last decades and that people are not as, forgotten about events as some of them think we are in Western Europe, but in the developing countries, it is my experience, people have a long memory and there is an accumulative recognizing of, what the policies of the globalist countries were. And I think now we see that there is a general attitude, we don't take this anymore. For example, if you look at China, I mean, after Secretary of State Blinken had canceled his trip to China, claiming that the balloon incident, that this was a spy balloon by China, then, China denied that in any case. So after some months, Blinken goes to China and he says, okay, let's remedy the relations. And while he's still in China, President Biden says, China, Xi Jinping is a dictator, which naturally caused a big uproar in China. And then Blinken confirmed it. He says he agrees with everything Biden says. So, I think that there is really there is a discrepancy, a gap, because the countries of the global south have the idea enough is enough. And many countries or many politicians in the West still think they can do whatever they want and there will be never a response because they are the top ones and the best ones and the beautiful ones and the smart ones. But that is no longer the case. And I think that there is right now a much, much stronger determination by the leaders of the South to basically say, we do not want to hear your Sunday sermons. We want to have real development. We want to have infrastructure, ports, streets, highways. So I think we are experiencing right now a very important, change. And, you can actually see who is offering what. The Africans are generally saying, if you talk to the Europeans, you get a Sunday speech, but if you talk to China, you get a port or you get a railway. And I think that is really the difference. And I think the more people are speaking out, the better. But I still think we need to move the whole discussion on a new paradigm, a higher order, because we are in a period of change, where the tendency would be very quickly to say, let these other people go to hell, we do our own thing. But the big danger right now is that the world falls into two completely separate blocks, and that would also have the danger of a world war. So we have to think about a comprehensive order which takes into account the interest of every single nation of the world. I think China is the only country which has made a proposal in this direction. Xi Jinping always talks about the shared future of humanity. He has proposed a global security initiative, a global development initiative, and a global civilizational initiative, which together makes a package for a comprehensive new plan for all nations to work together based on their sovereignty and their respect for each other. Now, the Schiller Institute, is promoting this idea, especially since the war in Ukraine broke out, the idea that we need a new security and development architecture, which is in great affinity what China is saying. It's not the same because naturally our proposal is, coming from a Western philosophical conception, the idea that there is a natural law which is built in the physical universe. There is a lawfulness to which you can refer and on which you can rely. But it's going in a similar direction. There are many points of affinity between Confucian thinking and Western humanist thinking. And we have to lift the whole discussion on that level, because if we only remain on the level of poking each other's eye, then the destruction of civilization is a guarantee. And I think human beings have been created for something better. So that's what we should pursue.
What we're going to do today is we're going to create a kind of tension, we hope, in your thinking by taking the matter that you've just seen and explaining to you exactly why this is the center of the so-called Ukraine conflict, or the so-called Afghanistan conflict, or the so-called Iraq conflict, or the so-called Syria conflict, or the so-called Libya conflict, or the impending China conflict. That in fact, although it has sometimes been said that war is the pursuit of politics by other means, it cannot equally be said that war is the pursuit of economics by other means. And there is a difference, a kind of a factional circumstance, two systems before the world, shall we say. And this is a good time to discuss this because it's the eve of the celebration of the American Declaration of Independence of July 4th. And in order to put this forward so that we get the principles rather than the particulars of a particular political system or era of history, we want to try to paint a larger palette today about what is happening in the world as a whole. So we're going to start off today with Harley Schlanger, who is the spokesman for TLO. And Harley, in turn, will introduce the next person, Alex Greiner, who is a journalist and blogger. And we've got Mike Robinson from UK.com who will follow. But Harley, you've got the floor first. Set up the stage for us.
Okay, Dennis, thank you very much. 2 weeks ago on the Manhattan Project, I opened my discussion by quoting Vladimir Putin, who had just given a speech at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum before more than 100 representatives of 100 countries, several thousand businessmen, and so on. And when he was talking there about the shift going on, the tectonic shift, the earthquake going on in the economic and financial world, including the move away from the dollar. He said, today about 90% of settlements with the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union are in rubles, and more than 80% of the settlements with China are in rubles and yuan. He went on to say that this means that the ugly international system, which was neo-colonial in nature, has ceased to exist. Meanwhile, the multipolar world order is being reinforced, and this process is inevitable. Now, after saying that, I received several emails from people who said, well, why do you say this is a neo-colonial system? Do you agree with what Putin said? And why do you really believe that this present international order is about to come to an end? I think you just saw in the words of Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, an indication of the shift in thinking of key leaders in what's called the Global South. This was at the summit for a new global financial pact that was held in Paris. Macron presided over it. I presume it was an EU, IMF, World Bank conference. As Dennis said, they were talking about how are we going to get the money that we need to make the transition to a sustainable future, to a green future, and so on. And essentially what they were trying to do was put a fresh coat of paint on an old system. That is, the EU, with its financial policy and green policy, is trying to dictate a set of terms to African countries, as well as the rest of the world, what Blinken calls the rules-based order. And what we're seeing is that African leaders are seeing right through it. One after another, they denounced it. They talked about promises not being fulfilled in the past for money. They talked about the continuation of the old system through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. President Hichilema of Zambia said, you can say what you are, but we need more financing, more financing, more financing, not taxes on the poor. Kenya's President Ruto was very sharp. He said, giving the money to the IMF and the World Bank is not acceptable. And then he said, you're not hearing us. Now, EU leaders watching that, including Macron, and you saw the pained expression on his face, they may be learning what farmers in Texas always say. You can put lipstick on a pig, but that don't mean you're going to marry it. Now, the EU financial policy and green policy has nothing to do with development. Putting some windmills and some solar panels in Africa won't solve the problem. As Ramaphosa said, 600 million Africans lack electricity. And the idea that you're somehow going to deal with this through EU green policy is not being looked at kindly by the leaders of the Global South. Now, what's going on, and what's clear is you can see this battle between the two systems. And I want to take as an example of that, what's happening in France right now. As you probably know, there have been 3 or 4 straight nights of riots getting increasingly wild, cars being burned, stores burned, policemen clashing with demonstrators. And this started with something which was highly predictable, namely what seems on the surface to have been an attack on an immigrant, a young man who was shot and killed by police because he wouldn't stop his car when they demanded that he stop. Now, that's not to say that there's not racism in France, and that's not a problem. But the problem goes much deeper, and it's on several different levels, none of which are being discussed in the Western media for obvious reasons. For the same reason, there was very little reportage on what happened at the Macron EU meeting with the African leaders. If you just look at the recent period in France, you had the whole confrontation around the Yellow Vest movement, which began in November 2018 over fuel prices. So this was before the sanction policy on Russia. This was before the Ukraine war. This was in November 2018, where truckers and farmers and others couldn't afford the fuel they needed. And this continued for many, many months. Then you had the pension reform protests, because Macron basically said that they can't afford to give people full retirement at 64, or at 62 rather, so they have to wait till they're 64 years old. Now, what we saw was, again, months of protests, including millions of people in the street. And then last week, in response to the police violence and murder of a young French citizen of Algerian descent, we've seen ongoing, continuing riots. Now, what's the surface story here? Well, you have inflation. Energy costs are through the roof. Fuel costs. Some families are going hungry. They're having trouble affording housing, medicine, fuel, and food. And that's the surface problem. Deeper than that is young people have a sense there's no future. And not only that, there's a sense that the government is not listening, is not taking care of the needs of the people, not responding. And you put that together and it's a volatile mix. Now, there's more to it than that. And I think when we hear from him, Alex has a very interesting hypothesis as to what's going on. But I want to give you the response from Jacques Cheminade, the leader of the LaRouche movement in France, a several-time presidential candidate who's quite a prominent figure in French politics. Here's what Jacques tweeted out, and Jose, if you could put the post up. He talked about a chien lit, that is what's going on in the streets. He said, in its literary sense, chien lit means a mask for carnival. That's where we are. Politicians disguised as government officials, financiers as philanthropers, drug traffickers as bankers, and bandits as sentimental rioters. But then he says the fascists, the real ones, are waiting at the door. Then he goes on to say the word chien lit was historically connected to a mask or character from Carnival. Chien lit is a contraction for chien lit, which means shit on the bed. And he said, since then, the word is used as a synonym for disorderly social behavior, messy, anarchistic, chaotic. And so what we're seeing is something that is messy and chaotic, but could be used for something more. In other words, the situation in all of Europe is tense. You have problems in Germany with deindustrialization. You have the cost of living spiraling out of control. Same thing in the United Kingdom, in Italy, Spain, everywhere. And the social fabric is weak. And yet, what's the main story? The need to continue the war against Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is where you see you can get some insights into the actual nature of the battle, because it's not about the particulars. It's about the end of a system, as Putin was saying, a neo-colonial system, a system of rules that are made by the richest people for their benefit at the expense of the vast majority of the world's population. But there's now something new that's emerged. There's a new paradigm, a new potential for a development architecture to replace the IMF, World Bank, global central bankers system. This is something that Helge LaRouche identified several years ago. The emergence of a new paradigm, which is partly centered around the Belt and Road Initiative of China. But that's actually symbolic of a bigger question, which is the demands for real economic development for sovereign nations to take care of the people of countries that have, until recently, been colonies. Now, this is a full battle, and this is why there's a war against Russia in Ukraine. This is why there's a threat against China in the Indo-Pacific. It's the desperation of the old establishment to hold on to their privilege, and they're resorting to what Russian analyst Dmitry Trenin described as playing Russian roulette with nuclear war, which he said is a very dangerous thing to do. Now the question then comes up, what do we do? Do we engage in anarchic demonstrations and riots in the street, or do we sit at home and cry in our beer and watch television and use drugs? Well, the important thing is this fight can't wait till the next elections. There are many countries with elections in 2024, including the United States in November 2024. But the citizens of the West have to move now to tip the balance toward the global South, which means working with Russia, as John F. Kennedy proposed in the June 10th, 1963 speech, working with China, not seeing them as enemies, but seeing them as collaborators for the great projects of mankind. One of the interesting things from the Africa summit in Paris was that Lula from Brazil tore up his speech and said, after listening to the discussion, he realizes that there is a potential solution. The Grand Inga Canal, moving water from the Congo River that could provide electricity to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people in Africa. And it would cost a lot less than the $1 trillion that Macron was talking about for the green EU policy. So what's essential now in the West, in the transatlantic, in the Five Eyes countries, is a real peace movement, as outlined by Kennedy in the June 10th speech, which recognizes the humanity of the other, even if it's a different system, even if they're different religion. They worship differently than people in the West. Even countries that have smaller tribal factions, family factions, and so on. There is a human requirement that all of us must live up to, living for the benefit of the other. And this must replace, as Kennedy said, Pax Americana. The United States must not be the world's policeman. Right? We must not use NATO to enforce the rules of the so-called rules-based order. Now, that means for Americans, we have to reclaim our anti-imperial, anti-colonial tradition. Now, some people around the world say, well, that tradition's long gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Well, Lyndon LaRouche saw that tradition in John Kennedy, but he said it was a tradition that Kennedy got from Franklin Roosevelt and Roosevelt's idea of the post-war era, in which Roosevelt envisioned the United Nations playing the role as the center for dialogue and negotiations to deal with the decolonization of the world and the economic development of all nations for all citizens. And that's what Kennedy reflected in that June 10th speech. But it was there even before that Kennedy had this anti-imperial sense. In a 1954 speech in the Senate on Indochina, he essentially said, we cannot squander men and money and weapons in a war that can't be won. In a 1957 speech in the Senate on Algeria, he said that even though we honor the French as the nation that worked with us to help our revolution be successful, we cannot fail to be critical of them when they're engaged in these imperial policies. And this is what that American tradition is. Now, I want to leave you with a quote from one of the early presidents of the United States, John Quincy Adams, the sixth president. Some of you are familiar with part of the quote, but it actually reflects this true anti-colonial tradition of the American system. Jose, if you can put that up, please. John Quincy Adams, and this was on July 4th, 1821. He said, "After 50 years, the United States has, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own. The United States does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. That by involving itself in the internal affairs of other nations, the United States would destroy its own reason of existence. The fundamental maxims of her policy would become then no different than the empire America's revolution defeated. It would be then no longer the ruler of itself, but the dictator of the world." We have to urgently return to that tradition. That's not only the way to avoid the danger of nuclear war, but as Kennedy said, establish the conditions for peace for all men and women for all time. And that's what people should be thinking about in the United States as you commemorate the Declaration of Independence from July 4th, 1776. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.